The sound of Karen's screams pierced the quiet morning like a siren. Her white tennis outfit, pristine moments before, now splattered with dark, putrid sewage as it rained down from her fancy rotating sprinkler. The expression on her face transformed from smug satisfaction to horror in an instant as the foul liquid arced through the air, coating her prized wicker furniture and meticulously maintained flower beds. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some gasping, others failing to hide their smiles behind cupped hands. One man spilled his coffee in shock, while Mrs. Peterson across the street actually applauded. I watched it all unfold from my kitchen window, coffee mug clutched tightly in my trembling hand. This wasn't how I'd imagined spending my retirement years, waging suburban warfare against a tyrannical neighbor. 6 months of water theft, confrontations, and HOA battles had led to this moment. Every polite request ignored, every reasonable solution rejected, every proper channel exhausted. Sometimes, when you've tried everything by the book and nothing works, you have to close that book and write your own ending. As I watched Karen frantically trying to shut off the valve, slipping and sliding in the muck that now covered her immaculate lawn, I wondered if I'd gone too far. But then I remembered her words, delivered with that condescending smirk just days before. "Do something about it, I dare you." Well, Karen, challenge accepted. Let me tell you how a mild-mannered retiree ended up hooking his garden hose to a sewage tank and how it saved our neighborhood. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. My name is Harold Thompson, and at 67, I thought I'd seen it all. After 40 years as a civil engineer for the county, I'd settled into what I hoped would be a peaceful retirement in Oak Ridge Estates. A modest but well-maintained community of single-story homes with neat yards and quiet streets. My house isn't fancy, just a simple 3-bedroom ranch with a covered porch where I enjoy my morning coffee and the garden I've tended meticulously since my wife Martha passed 5 years ago. I've never been one for confrontation. Throughout my career, I was known as the reasonable one, the mediator, the man who could find common ground between warring departments. The neighbors have always described me as salt of the earth, reliable, fair-minded, and generally willing to lend a hand or a tool when needed. Then, Karen Wilkinson moved in across the street last September. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed even when collecting her mail, with that helmet of blonde hair that never moved in the breeze, and a voice that carried across 3 lawns when she was displeased, which was often. Within 2 weeks of unpacking, she'd appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of every HOA rule, written or imagined. She wasn't even on the board, mind you, but carried that clipboard everywhere, documenting infractions with the zeal of a tax auditor who works on commission. "Your trash can is visible from the street," she'd announced to poor Mrs. Abernathy, who was recovering from hip surgery. "Those wind chimes exceed the acceptable noise ordinance," she'd informed the Johnsons, whose teenage daughter had received them as a gift. No one was spared her scrutiny. Oak Ridge Estates had always been a live-and-let-live kind of place before Karen arrived. Our HOA existed mainly to maintain a community pool and organize the annual 4th of July barbecue. We had rules, sure, but they were enforced with common sense and compassion. Glenn Miller down the block had his colorful hammock. The Patels at the corner grew vegetables in their front yard. The Rodriguez kids sold lemonade every summer weekend. We were neighbors who borrowed cups of sugar and collected each other's mail during vacations. We weren't perfect, but we were a community, at least until Hurricane Karen blew in and decided to remake us all in her image of suburban perfection. It began on a crisp October morning. I had shuffled out to my front yard, coffee mug in hand, looking forward to a peaceful start to my day. Instead, I found myself standing in what felt like the aftermath of a monsoon. The grass squelched beneath my slippers, puddles reflecting the morning sun, and to my bewilderment, the ground around my faucet was noticeably damp. Most peculiar of all, the hose itself felt warm to the touch, as if it had recently been running. Living alone since Martha's passing, I knew I hadn't used it the night before. "Odd," I muttered, surveying the soaked lawn. My first thought turned to the simplest explanation. Perhaps I'd left the spigot dripping. But when I checked, it was tightly closed. No leaks, no cracks in the piping. Yet my yard looked like it had hosted a water balloon fight. 2 days later, my water bill arrived. When I tore open the envelope and unfolded the statement, I nearly spilled my coffee. The numbers stared back at me, unmistakable and alarming. My usage had nearly tripled from the previous month. $342 for water when I typically paid around $100. I spread my previous bills across the kitchen table and confirmed what I already knew. Something was very wrong. I began taking notes, marking down when my lawn appeared unusually wet. A pattern emerged. It was happening during early morning hours or when I made my weekly trip to the hardware store. Someone was using my water when they thought I wouldn't notice. But who would do such a thing? The mystery was solved on a Saturday morning. I had left for my usual grocery run, but halfway to the store, I realized I'd forgotten my list. Circling back to retrieve it, I pulled into my driveway just in time to witness Karen, in her pristine white tennis outfit and oversized sunglasses, boldly dragging my garden hose across the lawn to her driveway. She had connected it to a portable pressure washer and was vigorously spraying down her front porch with my water. I sat in my car, engine still running, too stunned to move. The audacity of it left me speechless. Karen looked up, noticed me watching, and had the nerve to smile and wave, as if we were co-conspirators in this arrangement. "Hope you don't mind," she called out cheerfully. "Just giving the porch a quick rinse. Your water pressure is so much better than mine." Before I could formulate a response, she turned her back and continued her cleaning, dismissing me in my own driveway. I went inside, anger building with each step. I watched through the window as she spent another 30 minutes washing her porch, steps, and even her mailbox with my water, on my dime. Later that afternoon, I walked across the street and knocked on her door. I had rehearsed what I would say, determined to remain civil despite my simmering frustration. Karen answered in a fresh outfit, her hair perfectly styled as if she were expecting company. "Harold, what a pleasant surprise," she said, though her eyes suggested it was anything but. "Karen," I began, keeping my voice even, "I noticed you were using my hose and water earlier today. I'd prefer if you asked permission before doing that. My water bill has been unusually high lately." Her expression shifted from faux warmth to something harder. "Oh, Harold, don't be so particular. I just needed a quick wash, and your spigot is so conveniently positioned." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure the HOA wouldn't mind neighbors sharing resources. We're all supposed to be a community, right?" "Community doesn't mean using others' utilities without permission," I explained. "That water isn't free, Karen. I pay for every gallon." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "I'm sure the tiny amount I used barely registered on your bill. Let's not make mountains out of molehills." And with that, she closed the door in my face. Conversation over. I stood there, dumbfounded. In 40 years of professional life, I'd dealt with difficult personalities, but Karen's dismissive entitlement was something entirely new. This wasn't just about water. It was about respect, boundaries, and principles. The next day, I drafted a detailed email to the HOA board. I explained the situation, attached photographs of the wet lawn, included my water bills showing the unusual spike, and asked for clarification on whether utilities were indeed meant to be communal. I waited patiently for a response. 5 days later, I received a terse reply. "Thank you for your concern. At this time, we encourage all residents to resolve minor disputes amicably without HOA intervention." Translation: "You're on your own, old man." Not to be deterred, I purchased a locking mechanism for my outdoor faucet. It was a simple device, a metal cage that prevented access to the spigot without a key. Problem solved, I thought, as I secured it in place and tucked the key into my pocket. No more water theft, no more confrontation necessary. The following morning, I stepped outside to find the lock completely gone. Not unlocked, gone. The cut metal pieces lay scattered on the ground, the clean edges suggesting someone had used bolt cutters to remove it. I stared at the remains of my $32.99 solution, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising in my chest. As if on cue, I heard the familiar sound of spraying water. I looked up to see Karen across the street, my hose in hand, washing her luxury SUV. The water sparkled in the sunlight as it ran in rivulets down her pristine vehicle, pooling in her driveway before disappearing down the storm drain, along with my patience. I crossed the street with determined strides. "Karen," I called out, no longer bothering to mask my irritation, "did you cut the lock off my faucet?" She turned, water still spraying. "Oh, that thing. It was a safety hazard, Harold. Someone could have tripped. I took care of it." She flashed that dismissive smile again. "Your hose works much better for car washing than mine. The pressure is perfect." "That's because I paid for a quality hose," I said, "and I pay for the water running through it, which you're using without permission after deliberately destroying my property." "Don't be so dramatic," she replied, turning back to her task. "It's just water. Besides, I'm almost done." She continued spraying as if I weren't even there. I walked back to my house, my hands shaking with an anger I hadn't felt in years. The HOA wouldn't help. Polite conversation hadn't worked. Even physical barriers had proven useless against Karen's entitlement. As I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the neighborhood I'd called home for over a decade, I realized this wasn't going to resolve itself through conventional means. Sometimes, when reasonable fails, you have to get creative. That evening, after my failed confrontation with Karen, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, sketching out options. Martha would have urged caution. She was always the voice of reason. But Martha wasn't here, and I had reached my limit. I decided it was time for evidence. The next morning, I drove to the electronics store and purchased a small motion-activated security camera. Nothing fancy or conspicuous, just a reliable device I could mount discreetly under the eaves near my water spigot. If Karen wouldn't respect my property, perhaps she'd respect documented proof of her trespassing. Installation was straightforward, taking advantage of skills honed through decades of home maintenance. The camera offered a clear view of the faucet area and part of the front yard, with motion alerts sent directly to my phone. I felt a small sense of victory as I tested the system. Technology might be a young person's game, but this old engineer could still adapt when necessary. I didn't have to wait long. At 7:42 the next morning, my phone buzzed with an alert. I opened the app to see Karen, dressed in yoga pants and a windbreaker, stealthily crossing my lawn. She moved with practiced efficiency, quickly connecting my hose to her portable sprinkler. The footage was crystal clear, her face visible, her actions unmistakable. For nearly 40 minutes, she used my water to saturate her lawn, wash her car, and even fill a small wading pool for her designer dog. All before most neighbors had their first cup of coffee. Over the next 3 days, I compiled a comprehensive video record of Karen's water theft. Each morning, like clockwork, she would help herself to my resources, sometimes glancing around furtively, other times moving with the confidence of someone who believed rules simply didn't apply to her. The entitlement was staggering. Armed with irrefutable evidence, I decided to try the community approach. I posted a clip to our neighborhood's online forum with the neutral heading, "Ongoing Water Usage Issue on Maple Drive." I didn't name Karen directly, though her identity was obvious in the footage. I simply stated that I was seeking advice on handling unauthorized use of my utilities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors I barely knew commented with their own Karen stories, complaints about her noise monitoring, her unsolicited landscaping critiques, her campaigns against holiday decorations deemed excessive. Glenn from down the street revealed she had reported his hammock to the HOA 3 times. The Johnsons shared that she had measured the height of their grass with a ruler. It seemed everyone had a Karen grievance, but all had been too reluctant to speak up individually. What I hadn't anticipated was Karen's online presence. By that evening, she had seen the post. At precisely 7:18 p.m., my doorbell rang with an insistent, prolonged press. When I opened the door, Karen stood on my porch, arms crossed, face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" she hissed, foregoing any pretense of neighborly civility. "You're filming me without consent. That's an invasion of privacy. I could sue you for this." "It's a security camera on my property, Karen," I replied calmly. "Recording activities on my property. There's no expectation of privacy when you're trespassing to steal my water." "Trespassing? Stealing?" She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Don't be ridiculous. I was simply borrowing an insignificant amount of water." $300 worth last month, I countered. "That's not insignificant to me." "You're creating a hostile environment," she declared. "The HOA will hear about this." That camera is probably against regulations. The HOA already knows about the water theft. They chose not to intervene. Karen's expression darkened. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You're making a mistake, Harold. I have friends on the board. I know the bylaws better than anyone on this street. You're just a lonely old man with nothing better to do than harass neighbors trying to maintain their homes. Her words stunned more than I cared to admit. Was that how the neighborhood viewed me? A bitter widower with too much time on his hands? I straightened my posture, finding strength in the principles that had guided my life. I'm not harassing anyone, Karen. I'm protecting my property. Well, your little camera stunt changes nothing, she said, eyes narrowing. I'll use whatever water I need, whenever I need it. Do something about it. I dare you. With that parting challenge, she turned and strode back across the street, leaving me standing in my doorway, her words echoing in my mind. Do something about it. I dare you. That dare changed everything. Something shifted in me that evening, a lifetime of accommodation and reasonable compromise, giving way to a determination I hadn't felt in years. Karen had miscalculated. She saw a mild-mannered retiree she could bully and dismiss. She didn't see the man who had once rerouted an entire county's drainage system during the flood of '83, or who had designed water delivery systems for 3 municipal developments. I closed my door and went straight to my home office. If Karen wanted to escalate this, I would oblige her. Not with anger or malice, but with the methodical problem-solving approach that had defined my professional life. I began researching, making calls to former colleagues, sketching preliminary designs in my engineering notebook. The solution needed to be effective, reversible, and technically legal. Most importantly, it needed to deliver a lesson in boundaries that Karen wouldn't soon forget. As I worked through the technical aspects, I couldn't help questioning my motives. Was this pettiness, revenge, or was it something more fundamental, a stand against the erosion of basic decency and respect? Martha would probably counsel forgiveness, but even Martha had her limits when it came to bullies. 3 days later, I finalized my plan. It was elegant in its simplicity, requiring materials I could acquire legitimately and modifications that wouldn't permanently alter any structures. As I reviewed my design one last time, I felt a curious mix of apprehension and resolve. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for the quiet dignity of being respected in my own home during my retirement years. Karen had thrown down the gauntlet with her dare, apparently believing that men of my generation would always back down rather than cause a scene. She would soon discover her miscalculation. The implementation of my plan required careful preparation. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with in terms of water flow, pressure, and delivery systems. Though retired, I still maintained connections with former colleagues in municipal engineering. A discreet call to my old friend Bill yielded valuable information about temporary water diversion techniques used during construction projects. Another call to Samuel, who now worked in agricultural irrigation, helped me refine the design to ensure it would function precisely as intended. The most challenging aspect would be the access to what I needed for the diversion. Fortune smiled on me when I noticed a construction crew setting up at the edge of our neighborhood, working on sewer line maintenance. Their temporary setup included holding tanks, not for sewage precisely, but for the gray water and runoff created during their pipe cleaning operations. I drove by casually, observing their system, then returned the next day with a thermos of coffee. "Mighty cold work," I said, offering the hot coffee to a middle-aged worker who introduced himself as Mike. We got to talking, as men on job sites often do. I mentioned my background in civil engineering, which piqued his interest. After 20 minutes of shop talk about water pressure systems and municipal infrastructure, the kind of conversation that would bore most people to tears, I broached the subject. "I'm conducting a small experiment at home," I explained, "working on a demonstration of water recycling for my grandson's science project. Would need access to some of that gray water you're collecting just for a single evening. Nothing that would interfere with your operation." Mike scratched his chin. "Not supposed to let anyone mess with the equipment." I nodded understandingly and reached for my wallet. Of course, wouldn't want to cause any trouble. Perhaps a consulting fee for your expertise? Say $100 for an hour of your time and a small sample of the water? He glanced around, then nodded. Tuesday evening, we knock off at 5. Come by around 6 when the site's clear. With access secured, I began assembling the other components. I purchased a valve splitter, additional hose sections, connectors, and underground piping from 3 different hardware stores to avoid raising suspicion. In my garage workshop, I constructed a simple but effective switching mechanism that would allow me to control which water source fed into my garden hose, clean tap water, or the alternative supply from the holding tank. The most challenging part was the underground installation. Over the course of 3 nights, working after dark with only a small headlamp, I dug a narrow trench from my spigot to the side of my house, carefully removing and replacing sections of grass so the disturbance wouldn't be visible. I ran a secondary hose line through this channel, concealing it completely. The switch mechanism was hidden in an innocuous garden box near the foundation. To anyone looking, there would be nothing unusual about my standard garden hose setup, but with the flip of a concealed switch, the source could be instantly changed. On Tuesday evening, as arranged, I met Mike at the construction site. He helped me fill several large containers with the gray water from their holding tank, not raw sewage, but dirty water from their pipe cleaning operation. It smelled unpleasant and had a murky appearance, but contained no dangerous contaminants. I was careful about this. I wanted to teach Karen a lesson, not create a health hazard. Transporting the containers in my truck bed, covered with a tarp, I returned home and completed the final connections in my system. A test run confirmed everything functioned perfectly. With the switch in one position, clean tap water flowed normally through the hose. With it flipped, the alternative supply would feed through instead. I returned the switch to the normal position and coiled the hose neatly by the spigot, an innocent-looking invitation. Throughout this process, I'd been conscious of the cameras capturing my work. I was careful to position myself to block critical details from being recorded. If questioned later, I could truthfully say I was doing landscape maintenance and irrigation work. Nothing illegal about a man improving his own property, after all. While I worked on my engineering solution, the neighborhood dynamic was shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Glenn from down the street stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a hedge trimmer. "Saw that video you posted," he said, leaning against my porch rail. "That Karen woman reported my hammock to the HOA again yesterday. Said the colors decreased neighborhood aesthetic value. 3rd time this month." "Sorry to hear that," I replied, genuinely sympathetic. Glenn's hammock was a cheerful splash of color, hardly an eyesore. "Some of us were talking," he continued. "The Patels, the Johnsons, even old Mrs. Abernathy, were tired of walking on eggshells around her. Thought maybe we should attend the next HOA meeting together, make our voices heard." I hadn't intended to spark a neighborhood rebellion, but it seemed my stand against Karen had emboldened others. Over the next week, more neighbors stopped by, some I'd barely spoken with in years. Each had a Karen story. Tom's bird feeder that allegedly attracted vermin. The Rodriguez family's children being reported for excessive noise while playing in their own backyard. Mrs. Abernathy's mailbox that was 2 inches too high according to Karen's measurements. "You're doing what we all wanted to," Mrs. Rodriguez told me, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Standing up to the neighborhood bully." These conversations were heartening but also concerning. I was now the de facto leader of an anti-Karen movement, a position I'd never sought. Martha would have cautioned me about the responsibilities that came with such a role. "Harold," I could almost hear her saying, "be careful you don't become what you're fighting against." This thought troubled me as I finalized my trap. Was I crossing a line? In 40 years of professional life, I'd always found diplomatic solutions to problems. Now, in retirement, I was rigging a hose system to spray my neighbor with dirty water. Had I lost perspective? Was this acceptable behavior for a man of my age and standing? I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint Karen's white colonial house in shades of orange and pink. She was out front, meticulously trimming her hedges into geometric perfection. For a moment, I saw her not as the neighborhood tyrant, but as a woman alone, perhaps finding security in controlling her environment when she couldn't control other aspects of life. Did that excuse her behavior? No, but it reminded me that my goal wasn't to humiliate her. It was to establish boundaries. That night, I nearly dismantled the whole system. What stopped me was the memory of her standing in my doorway, issuing that cold challenge. Do something about it. I dare you. There was no hint of compromise in her eyes, no recognition of the harm her actions caused. Some lessons could only be taught through consequences. At dawn the next morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. Karen was making her move, earlier than usual. I watched through the camera as she crept across my lawn in the half-light, dressed in her tennis whites despite the early hour. She moved with practiced efficiency, disconnecting my hose and dragging it across to her yard. This time, she'd brought a rotating sprinkler, which she placed in the center of her lawn before returning to turn on my spigot. My heart pounded as I watched from my bedroom window. The moment of truth had arrived. I hesitated, finger hovering over the switch hidden in the garden box control I could access from inside my house through a simple remote mechanism. Was I really going to do this? 67 years of playing by the rules, and now this? Then I remembered my water bill, the cut lock, the dismissive way she'd spoken to me as if I were irrelevant in my own home. Before I could reconsider, I flipped the switch. Through the camera view on my phone, I had a perfect angle to witness what happened next. Karen stood impatiently by her sprinkler, hands on hips, waiting for the water to come through. There was a brief splutter, then a gurgle in the line as the alternative water source fed into the system. The sprinkler began to turn, and with it came the first spray of murky, foul-smelling water. Karen didn't immediately register what was happening. She was looking at her watch, perhaps planning the rest of her morning. It wasn't until the sprinkler completed its first rotation, sending another arc of dirty water across her pristine lawn and white wicker furniture, that she noticed something was terribly wrong. Her reaction was everything I'd anticipated and more. First came confusion. She stepped closer to the sprinkler, peering at it as if it had malfunctioned. Then horror as she realized what was actually spraying from the nozzle. Her scream could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Karen lunged for the sprinkler, but in her haste, she slipped on the now slick grass and fell, further soiling her tennis outfit. By the time she regained her footing and managed to grab the hose, the damage was done. Her lawn, her porch, her wicker furniture, and yes, Karen herself were all thoroughly doused in grimy water. She wrestled with the hose, finally yanking it from the sprinkler, but not before another spray caught her directly. I quickly switched the valve back to normal as she ran to my spigot to turn it off, cursing loudly enough for early rising neighbors to hear. Several had already emerged from their homes, drawn by her screams. Mrs. Abernathy stood on her porch in a bathrobe, mouth open in shock. Glenn was in his driveway, not even trying to hide his smile. I felt a complex mixture of emotions watching this scene unfold. There was satisfaction, certainly, a sense of justice served after months of Karen's entitlement and theft. But there was also a twinge of regret at having resorted to such measures. This wasn't who I'd been for most of my life. Martha would have been both amused and disappointed in me, I suspected. Yet as I watched Karen storm back to her house, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across her perfect concrete path, I couldn't deny the effectiveness of the lesson. Some people only understand boundaries when they experience consequences. Throughout that day, I watched through my window as Karen unleashed a flurry of activity. She hosed down her porch with her own water, scrubbed her furniture, and even called what appeared to be a lawn service for an emergency treatment. Her tennis whites went straight into the trash bin rather than her washing machine. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was buzzing with the news. Though only a few had witnessed the incident firsthand, the story spread with remarkable speed. My phone rang several times, Glenn, the Rodriguezes, even Mrs. Abernathy calling to confirm what they'd heard. I neither confirmed nor denied anything, simply saying there had been an unfortunate irrigation mishap across the street. By evening, the mood in our little community had shifted palpably. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of collective relief. On my evening walk, neighbors waved and smiled with newfound warmth. 2 different households invited me for dinner. Someone had anonymously left a bottle of fine scotch on my porch with a note reading simply, "To boundaries." I was unprepared, however, for my own transformation through this process. For years following Martha's death, I had withdrawn from community involvement, finding comfort in routine and solitude. Now suddenly, I was at the center of a neighborhood social web. People sought my advice on dealing with HOA issues. Younger couples asked for help with their irrigation systems. I found myself accepting invitations I would have declined a month earlier. Most surprising was my own sense of renewed purpose. Standing up to Karen had awakened something I thought had retired, along with my professional credentials: the satisfaction of solving problems, of making systems work properly, whether those systems were water delivery networks or social dynamics. That evening, as I sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood's rhythms, I spotted Karen through her front window. She was on the phone, gesturing animatedly, her face set in lines of fury. I had no doubt she was plotting her counterattack. The water incident wouldn't be the end of our conflict, merely the opening salvo in what might become a protracted neighborhood war. But for the first time since she'd moved in, I felt prepared for whatever came next. I had established my boundary line, demonstrated the consequences of crossing it, and reclaimed my standing in the community. Most importantly, I'd remembered something essential about myself. Underneath the polite, reasonable exterior of an aging engineer beat the heart of a man who still knew how to fight for what was right. As twilight deepened into night, I raised my glass of scotch in a silent toast toward Martha's photograph on the side table. "You probably wouldn't approve of my methods, dear," I murmured. "But I think you'd be proud I didn't let myself be walked over." The ice clinked against the glass, and somewhere in the evening breeze, I almost felt her amused agreement. The morning after the sprinkler incident dawned with an unusual stillness in our neighborhood. I rose at my customary hour of 6:15, brewed my coffee, and took up my observation post at the kitchen window. Karen's house remained dark, curtains drawn tight against the morning light. Her normally pristine lawn still bore the evidence of yesterday's disaster. Dark patches where the dirty water had pooled, the white wicker furniture conspicuously absent from the porch. I sipped my coffee, mentally preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 8:32 a.m., as I was rinsing my breakfast dishes, my security camera alerted me to movement at the front of my property. Karen was marching across the street with purposeful strides, dressed in a crisp pantsuit, as if heading to court. Her hair was immaculately styled, her makeup flawless, armor donned for battle. I dried my hands, straightened my sweater, and opened the door before she could ring the bell. "Good morning, Karen," I said, maintaining a neutral expression. Her face contorted with barely contained fury. "Don't you good morning me, Harold. You know exactly what you did." Several neighbors, out collecting their newspapers or walking dogs, slowed their pace to watch the confrontation unfold. Karen noticed the audience and lowered her voice, though the intensity remained. "My imported wicker furniture is ruined. My lawn has been contaminated. My roses may never recover, and my tennis outfit—" She stopped, apparently too outraged to continue that particular thread. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I replied calmly, "though I did notice you using my water again yesterday morning, despite our previous discussions about that being unacceptable." "Your water?" she hissed. "What was coming out of that hose wasn't water. It was sewage. You deliberately set a trap." "That's a serious accusation, Karen," I said, keeping my voice even. "What evidence do you have that I did anything at all? Perhaps the water main had sediment issues. Perhaps your sprinkler was contaminated from previous use. Perhaps. Don't play innocent with me. I know what you did. And so help me, I will make you pay for this. The HOA will hear about this dangerous, disgusting, hostile act. The health department will be notified. The police." "The police?" I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "And what exactly would you tell them? That you were stealing my water, again after cutting the lock off my faucet, trespassing on my property, and extending the theft to include my hose itself, when the consequences of your actions proved unpleasant?" Her mouth opened and closed wordlessly for a moment. Behind her, I could see Glenn pausing his morning walk to observe our exchange, not even pretending to adjust his shoelaces. "This isn't over, Harold," Karen finally managed, her voice quivering with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections in this community. And I have video evidence," I replied quietly. "Of every instance you've helped yourself to my property. Would you like me to share that evidence with these connections of yours?" She stepped back as if I'd physically struck her. For just a moment, uncertainty flashed across her face. Then the mask of righteous indignation slammed back into place. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," she announced, turning on her heel and stalking back toward her house with rigid dignity, despite the curious gazes of our neighbors. I watched her retreat, wondering if I'd pushed the situation too far. I'd anticipated her anger, but not the threat of legal action. Had I crossed a line from clever defense into legally actionable territory? The murky water wasn't dangerous, I'd been careful about that, but I had intentionally set a trap. The thought of explaining my actions to a judge was concerning. By afternoon, the entire neighborhood knew about the confrontation. The story had grown with each retelling, as neighborhood stories tend to do. According to Mrs. Abernathy, Karen had slipped and fallen headfirst into a pool of sewage. According to Tom Rodriguez, I had installed an elaborate underground sewage system specifically to teach Karen a lesson. By the time the mail carrier arrived with tales from 3 blocks over, I had apparently rigged my entire property with booby traps, and Karen had been hospitalized with contamination exposure. I attempted to correct these exaggerations when I could, but the neighborhood had embraced this new mythology with enthusiasm. For the first time since Karen had arrived, people were openly gathering on front lawns, talking and laughing together, without fear of clipboard citations for excessive congregation. Around 4 o'clock, Glenn knocked on my door, a concerned expression on his usually jovial face. "Karen's over at the Hendersons," he reported without preamble. "Richard Henderson is on the HOA board, in case you didn't know. They've been in there for over an hour." Richard Henderson was indeed on the board, the newest member, elected after I had largely withdrawn from community affairs. He had a reputation for being easily influenced by stronger personalities, which made him the perfect target for Karen's manipulations. "Thanks for the heads up," I told Glenn, genuinely appreciative of the intelligence. "We're with you, Harold," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever comes next." What came next arrived promptly at 9 a.m. the following morning. A formal letter from the HOA was placed in my mailbox, not mailed but hand-delivered, suggesting urgent business. The envelope contained a notice of violation, citing creation of unsanitary conditions endangering community health and hostile actions against a fellow resident. The penalty, a $600 fine payable within 30 days, and a mandatory appearance before the board to discuss ongoing behavioral concerns. I read the letter twice, noting with professional interest the careful avoidance of any specific allegations. The document hinted at serious offenses without actually naming them, a technique designed to discourage challenge. Karen's influence was evident in every carefully worded paragraph. My immediate reaction was indignation. After 40 years of exemplary citizenship, paying taxes and HOA dues without complaint, maintaining my property to standards that exceeded requirements, I was being treated like a misbehaving child. The impulse to crumple the letter and ignore it entirely was strong. Instead, I reached for my phone and called the HOA office directly, asking to speak with the board president. After several transfers and holds, I finally reached Margaret Williams, who had served as president for nearly a decade. "Margaret," I began, "this is Harold Thompson from Maple Drive. I've just received a rather concerning notice about alleged violations." "Yes, Harold," she replied, her tone carefully professional. "The board met in emergency session yesterday to address a serious complaint." "A complaint made by Karen Wilkinson, I presume?" A slight pause. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific source of the complaint." "Margaret, we've known each other for 12 years, I reminded her. "You were at Martha's funeral. Do you honestly believe I would deliberately create unsanitary conditions in our neighborhood?" Another pause, longer this time. "The evidence presented was compelling, Harold. Photographs, witness statements." "Witnesses who actually saw me do anything?" I pressed. or witnesses who simply saw the aftermath and heard Karen's version of events. Harold, please understand our position. When allegations of this nature are made, the board must take them seriously. Health and safety concerns. I understand completely, I interrupted, and I'll be happy to address these concerns at the board meeting. I'll also be bringing my own evidence, including comprehensive video footage of Mrs. Wilkinson repeatedly trespassing on my property to steal utilities after destroying a security lock I had installed. I trust the board will take those violations equally seriously. The silence that followed was telling. Video footage? Margaret finally asked, her tone markedly different. Continuous recording from multiple angles, documenting every instance of trespassing and theft over the past 3 weeks. Time-stamped and clear as day. I'd be happy to provide copies to the board, and to the police if necessary. That won't be necessary just yet, Margaret said quickly. Perhaps we should review all evidence before the formal hearing. I think that would be wise, I agreed. I'll prepare a complete package for the board's review. After ending the call, I set to work compiling my evidence. I edited the security footage into a clear, chronological record of Karen's repeated intrusions, adding captions noting dates and times. I created a spreadsheet documenting the increase in my water bills corresponding with her arrival in the neighborhood. I even included photographs of the destroyed lock with cost receipts. What I deliberately excluded was any footage of my own preparations, the underground hose installation, the switching mechanism, the containers of murky water. My case needed to focus entirely on Karen's violations, not my response to them. As I worked, my phone periodically buzzed with messages from concerned neighbors. Word of the HOA action had spread quickly. Glenn offered to speak as a character witness. The Rodriguezes volunteered documentation of their own run-ins with Karen. Even Mrs. Abernathy, who rarely left her house due to mobility issues, called to express her support. By evening, what had begun as an individual stand against one difficult neighbor had evolved into something larger. A community reclaiming its identity from the grip of petty tyranny. People were talking to each other across property lines, sharing stories, offering support. Karen had inadvertently accomplished what years of HOA-sponsored block parties had failed to do. She had united us. The next morning brought a surprising development. An email from Margaret Williams arrived in my inbox, its formal language barely concealing her discomfort. Upon further review of the situation between residents of Maple Drive, the HOA board has determined that additional investigation is warranted before proceeding with any penalties. The fine issued to Harold Thompson is temporarily suspended pending a full hearing. Additionally, the board wishes to remind all residents that unauthorized use of another resident's utilities constitutes a violation of HOA Bylaw 4.2b and may result in sanctions. Victory wasn't complete, but the tide had clearly turned. The reference to Bylaw 4.2b, which I had specifically cited in my conversation with Margaret, was a clear signal that Karen's complaint had backfired. The board was now on notice that they faced a potential embarrassment if they continued to support her uncritically. Karen's reaction to this setback manifested that same afternoon. As I returned from a walk, I noticed her standing in her driveway with 2 men in suits, one clutching a clipboard in a manner reminiscent of Karen herself, the other taking photographs of her property, her lawn, and most pointedly, the direction of my house. A performance for my benefit, clearly. The message, "This isn't over." And indeed, it wasn't. As the sun set on that momentous day, I sat on my porch reflecting on how quickly life can change course. 2 weeks ago, I had been a quiet retiree, largely invisible to my neighbors, mourning my late wife and finding comfort in routine. Now I was at the center of a neighborhood drama, with allies and enemies, strategies and counter-strategies, all revolving around a garden hose and the fundamental question of respect. Martha would have been amused by the absurdity of it all, but she also would have cautioned me to be careful. "The problem with winning battles, Harold," she used to say, "is that it sometimes makes you forget the purpose of the war." As darkness fell over our little street, I wondered what victory in this particular war would actually look like, and what price I might ultimately pay to achieve it. 3 days after my minor victory with the HOA, I woke with a crushing pressure in my chest. At first, I attributed it to stress, the confrontation with Karen, the neighborhood drama, the looming HOA hearing. I took my regular morning medications, made coffee, and tried to proceed with my day as normal. But the pressure intensified, radiating down my left arm in a way that even I, stubborn as I am, couldn't ignore. I called my neighbor Glenn, who arrived in minutes and drove me to the emergency room. The diagnosis was swift and sobering, a minor heart attack. Not severe enough to require surgery, but significant enough to warrant 3 days in the hospital, a revised medication regimen, and stern warnings from Dr. Phillips about reducing stress. Your cardiac enzymes show this wasn't your first episode, she explained, reviewing my chart with the kind of concern that makes one feel simultaneously cared for and scolded. You've likely had some minor events you've brushed off as indigestion or anxiety. At your age, Mr. Thompson, that's a dangerous habit. As I lay in the hospital bed, tethered to monitors that beeped with each heartbeat, the absurdity of my situation became painfully clear. I had survived the loss of my beloved Martha, navigated 40 years of professional stress, and endured countless life challenges, only to have my health threatened by a dispute over a garden hose. Glenn visited daily, bringing updates from the neighborhood, along with magazines and home-cooked meals that the nurses pretended not to notice. Through him, I learned that word of my hospitalization had spread quickly through Oak Ridge Estates. The Rodriguezes had organized a meal train. Mrs. Abernathy had her grandson mow my lawn. Even people I barely knew left get-well cards on my porch. Karen's response, however, was quite different. According to Glenn, she had been overheard at the community mailboxes, suggesting that my health episode was conveniently timed to delay the HOA hearing and garner sympathy. Classic manipulation, she had apparently said to Richard Henderson. He knows he's in trouble, so he's playing the sick old man card. Those words stung more than I cared to admit. Throughout my life, I had prided myself on facing challenges directly, on being the reliable one others could count on. The suggestion that I would fake illness or use my age as a shield felt like an attack not just on my character, but on my entire sense of self. The day of my discharge from the hospital coincided with an unseasonably warm afternoon. Glenn drove me home, where I was surprised to find a small gathering of neighbors waiting on my lawn. They had hung a welcome home banner across my porch and prepared a light early dinner that could be easily reheated. Their kindness was overwhelming and exhausting. After brief thanks and assurances that I was on the mend, I retreated inside to rest. From my bedroom window I could see Karen's house. Her blinds were drawn, but her car was in the driveway. Was she watching this display of neighborhood solidarity? Was she planning her next move? The thought of continuing this conflict suddenly seemed incredibly draining. For the first time since our dispute began, I considered simply giving up, paying the fine, apologizing at the hearing, whatever it took to restore peace. That evening, as I sat on my porch attempting to enjoy the sunset despite my troubled thoughts, I noticed an unfamiliar SUV pull into Karen's driveway. A young man emerged, perhaps in his early 30s, with Karen's distinctive profile but softer features. He carried an overnight bag and embraced Karen briefly before they both went inside. A son, perhaps? In all the neighborhood gossip about Karen, no one had ever mentioned family. The next morning brought another surprising development. A formal letter arrived from the HOA stating that due to personal circumstances affecting multiple parties, the hearing regarding my alleged violations had been postponed indefinitely. No mention of the fine, whether it remained suspended or had been canceled altogether. The bureaucratic language offered no clues about what had prompted this decision. Glenn, of course, had theories. Richard Henderson's wife is on the hospital board, he explained when he stopped by to check on me. She probably got wind of your heart attack and realized how bad it would look if they pursued this now. Can you imagine the headlines? Homeowners Association harasses heart patient over garden hose? No HOA wants that kind of publicity. Perhaps he was right. Or perhaps someone on the board had finally reviewed my evidence and recognized the weakness of Karen's position. Whatever the reason, I felt a temporary reprieve, rather than a victory. The young man I'd seen continued to visit Karen daily, sometimes staying for hours, Other times just briefly dropping off groceries or what appeared to be prescription bags from the pharmacy. The neighborhood rumor mill, usually so efficient, offered no insights about his identity or the reason for his sudden appearance. A week after my return home, as I was gathering my mail, a task that now required a rest break halfway to the mailbox, I encountered Karen face to face for the first time since our confrontation. She was walking from her house to her car, and our paths crossed on the sidewalk. Up close, the changes in her were striking. The immaculate appearance had slipped. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, her face devoid of makeup, deep circles shadowing her eyes. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. "Harold," she acknowledged with a nod, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "Karen?" I replied, unsure what else to say. She hesitated, glancing back at her house. "I heard about your health situation. I trust you're recovering well." It wasn't quite concern, but it wasn't hostility either. I nodded. "Each day a little better. Thank you." Another pause, awkward and heavy. Then she added, "My son Ryan is staying with me for a while. He's a nurse." This last bit was offered with a hint of defensiveness, as if expecting me to question why she needed care. "I saw him visiting," I said. "Is everything all right?" The question surprised us both, I think, genuine concern cutting through weeks of animosity. Karen's composure slipped momentarily. "No," she admitted, then straightened her shoulders. "But it will be. These things, they take time." She moved toward her car, then stopped and turned back. "I've asked the HOA to drop the complaint against you. It seemed unnecessary given everything else." Before I could respond, she was in her car and backing out of the driveway, leaving me standing bewildered at my mailbox. What everything else could have transformed the neighborhood tyrant into this subdued version of herself in just a few weeks? The answer came 2 days later from an unexpected source. Abernathy called me on her landline. She still refused to use a mobile phone, to share what she'd learned while at her doctor's appointment. "The receptionist at Dr. Feldman's office is Karen Wilkinson's cousin," she explained without preamble. She let slip that Karen's been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. "Found it just after that business with your hose. Her son's taken leave from his job in Chicago to help her through the initial treatments." The news hit me like a physical blow. In all my calculations, in all my justifications for teaching Karen a lesson, I had never considered that she might be fighting her own private battles. The controlling behavior, the need to impose order on her environment, even the seemingly irrational focus on minor neighborhood infractions. How much of that had been a desperate attempt to control something, anything, when her own health and future were slipping beyond her grasp? That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had once brought comfort but now seemed hollow. The neighborhood was quiet, each house containing its own private struggles invisible from the street. How many other tragedies were playing out behind closed doors while we focused on garden hoses and HOA bylaws? Martha would have known what to do. She always had an intuitive sense for when to stand firm and when to extend grace. Looking at the empty chair beside me where she used to sit, I felt her absence more keenly than I had in months. "What a mess I've made, old girl," I whispered to the gathering darkness. "What would you have me do now?" The morning after learning about Karen's diagnosis, I found myself awake before dawn, my thoughts too restless for sleep. With careful movements, mindful of my recovery, I made my way to the home office I had once used for consulting work after retirement. The room had gradually become a storage space for memories. Filing cabinets full of documents I couldn't bring myself to discard, shelves lined with engineering texts, and boxes of neighborhood association materials from years when I had served on various committees. It was these latter items I sought now. With methodical determination, I began examining the HOA documentation I had accumulated during my more active years. Bylaws, amendments, meeting minutes, I reviewed them all with the focused attention that had characterized my professional career. If Karen had used the system against me, perhaps the system itself contained the solution. By mid-morning, surrounded by stacks of papers organized in precise chronological order, I found what I had been searching for. Section 4.2b of the bylaws, buried in a subsection about property boundaries and easements. Any homeowner caught trespassing on another resident's property without express permission, particularly for the use of utilities, will be subject to immediate investigation, fines, and potential removal of HOA benefits. The language was unambiguous. Karen's repeated use of my water constituted a clear violation, one that carried penalties potentially exceeding those threatened against me. More importantly, the documentation revealed that Richard Henderson, the board member seemingly in Karen's corner, had a conflict of interest. As chairman of the Architectural Control Committee, he had approved several of Karen's property modifications, with questionable speed, while rejecting similar requests from other residents. Armed with this knowledge, I carefully assembled a comprehensive evidence package. I included my security footage showing multiple instances of Karen using my water without permission. I added water bill comparisons demonstrating the financial impact. I included photographs of the cut lock and documentation of my attempts to resolve the issue through appropriate channels. Finally, I attached copies of the relevant bylaws, with key sections highlighted. Rather than submitting this directly to the full board, I scheduled a private meeting with Margaret Williams, the HOA president. Margaret had always been fair-minded, if somewhat bureaucratic, in her approach. More importantly, she and Martha had served together on the Community Garden Committee years ago, establishing a rapport that had survived Martha's passing. "This is quite comprehensive, Harold," Margaret noted, reviewing the materials in her dining room. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she examined each document with careful attention. "Why didn't you bring this forward earlier?" "I tried to handle it privately first," I explained, "and then, when that failed, I tried proper channels. But it seems certain board members may have personal reasons for dismissing my concerns." Margaret's expression tightened slightly at the implied criticism of her leadership. "You're referring to Richard." "The evidence suggests a pattern of preferential treatment," I said diplomatically. She removed her glasses, folding them precisely. "I've had concerns about some of Richard's decisions, but accusations of bias require substantial support." "Which I've provided," I noted, gesturing to the documentation before her. She nodded slowly. "Yes, you have. But Harold, given Karen's current situation, is this really the direction you want to pursue?" The question struck at the heart of my dilemma. Did I want justice, or did I want peace? Was it right to press my advantage when Karen faced a life-threatening illness? But then, was it fair to simply dismiss her behavior because circumstances had changed? "I don't want to punish Karen," I finally said. "That was never my goal. I just wanted respect for my property, my boundaries, and my right to say no. The HOA failed to support those basic expectations when I needed it to." Margaret had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "The board should have taken your initial complaints more seriously," she acknowledged. "That responsibility falls on me as president." "Then help me fix this properly," I said. "Not with fines or public hearings, but with clear boundaries that protect everyone." The resulting strategy unfolded gradually over the next week. Margaret discreetly approached other board members individually, sharing selected portions of my evidence and expressing concerns about potential liability for the HOA itself should similar situations arise in the future. Without directly confronting Richard's potential conflicts of interest, she effectively isolated him from decision-making regarding my case. Word spread through the neighborhood with remarkable speed, not through official channels, but through the invisible network of phone calls, driveway conversations, and shared dog walks that constitutes real community governance. Glenn kept me updated on the shifting sentiment. "People are talking," he reported, joining me for coffee on my porch. "Not just about you and Karen anymore, but about how the HOA operates. The Patels are questioning why their vegetable garden request was denied when Karen's koi pond was approved in half the time. The Johnsons want to know why they were fined for their wind chimes when the Hendersons' outdoor speakers play music until 11 p.m. That's not exactly what I intended, I admitted, concerned about unleashing broader discord. Glenn smiled. Sometimes you have to shake the tree to see which branches are rotten. Richard's suddenly very eager to review procedures for greater consistency. Amazing what a little scrutiny can accomplish. As these currents of change moved through our community, I remained focused on my own situation with Karen. Despite knowing about her illness, I maintained the security cameras and kept my modified hose system in place, though I had permanently disabled the diversion valve. Trust, once broken, requires more than sympathy to restore. 3 days after my meeting with Margaret, an unexpected development shifted the landscape entirely. A recording of an HOA executive session was anonymously emailed to several homeowners, including myself. In it, Karen could be heard demanding action against me, describing me as a menace, and suggesting that my age made me incapable of maintaining appropriate standards. Most damning was Richard Henderson's audible agreement and promise to handle the Thompson situation. The recording's authenticity was never confirmed, nor was the source identified. Given the participants' embarrassment, no one pressed too hard for verification. What mattered was its impact. Karen's carefully cultivated image as a concerned neighbor crumbled in the face of her own words. Richard Henderson submitted his resignation from the board the following day, citing personal commitments that prevented him from fulfilling his duties. For Karen, this public exposure coincided with the visible advancement of her illness. Her son was now a constant presence, often helping her from car to house after what appeared to be medical appointments. The aggressive woman who had once marched across my lawn with imperious confidence now moved with the careful steps of someone conserving limited energy. I watched these developments with complicated emotions. The situation had resolved in my favor, yet victory felt hollow. In engineering, we learn that most structural failures occur not because of one catastrophic error, but through a series of small miscalculations that compound over time. So it seemed with this neighborhood conflict. A series of small unkindnesses, rigid rules, and missed opportunities for understanding had created a collapse no one had intended. 2 weeks after the recording surfaced, as I was pruning my rose bushes, a task my cardiologist had only reluctantly approved, Karen's son Ryan approached me. He was a solid young man with his mother's determined chin but gentler eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "my mother would like to speak with you if you're willing. She's having a good day today, and," he hesitated, "she may not have many chances left." I thought the prognosis for early-stage breast cancer was generally positive these days, I said, surprised by the gravity in his tone. Ryan's expression tightened. They discovered it had already metastasized when they began treatment. The initial diagnosis was incomplete. Understanding dawned. Karen wasn't facing a challenging but treatable condition. She was fighting for her life. The weight of our petty neighborhood war suddenly seemed unbearable. "Of course, I'll speak with her," I said, setting aside my garden tools. "Now?" He nodded, relief evident in his posture. "She's on the porch. She can't move around much these days." As I walked across the street to face my neighbor, my adversary who had become something more complicated through this journey, I realized that sometimes the truth isn't revealed in dramatic confrontations or clever strategies. Sometimes it emerges slowly, in the quiet spaces between our assumptions, in the humanity we discover when defenses finally fall away. Karen sat on her porch in a cushioned rattan chair, a light blanket across her lap despite the warm afternoon. The vibrant woman who had once patrolled our neighborhood with clipboard in hand was diminished, her features sharper, skin drawn tightly over cheekbones. Yet her eyes remained alert, tracking my approach with the same intensity I remembered, though perhaps without the former hostility. "Harold," she acknowledged as I reached the steps. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." She gestured to a matching chair positioned opposite hers. I settled carefully, mindful of my own recovery. For a moment we simply regarded each other, two adversaries finding themselves suddenly in the same boat, navigating waters neither had anticipated. "Ryan tells me your heart gave you a warning," she finally said. "Minor in the grand scheme," I replied. "And yours?" She glanced toward the horizon. "Not so minor, unfortunately. Stage 4. It spread before they caught it." Her directness surprised me. No euphemisms, no self-pity. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "As am I." She adjusted her blanket with thin fingers. "About many things, your water hose among them." The admission hung between us, unexpected in its simplicity. I had prepared for defenses, for qualifications, for the Karen who had confronted me on my doorstep. I hadn't prepared for honesty. I've been trying to understand, I said, why something so trivial became so important. She almost smiled. Control, she said. When you're losing it in one area, you grasp for it anywhere you can find it. She gestured vaguely toward her body. I suspected something was wrong months ago, ignored the signs, told myself I could manage it through discipline, through force of will, ridiculous in retrospect. And the neighborhood became your substitute battlefield, I suggested. The perfect distraction. Every mailbox at the right height, every lawn properly trimmed, every fence precisely to code. It all created the illusion that order was possible, that rules could protect us. Her laugh was dry, without humor. Cancer doesn't care about HOA bylaws, it turns out. We sat with that truth for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her immaculate lawn, maintained now by Ryan or perhaps a service, but still reflecting Karen's precision. I've sold the house, she said abruptly. Closing is next month. Ryan has taken me to Chicago to be near the specialist there and to spend whatever time I have left with my grandchildren. I didn't know you had grandchildren, I said, realizing how little we actually knew about each other despite our intense conflict. Twin boys, 6 years old, full of energy and chaos. Her expression softened for the first time. They FaceTime me every evening. They're the reason I'm fighting so hard. In that moment, Karen transformed from the neighborhood tyrant into a mother, a grandmother, a human being facing the ultimate loss of control. I thought of Martha, of how brave she had been through her illness, how she had worried more about me than herself near the end. The parallels twisted something in my chest. I won't be at the closing, Karen continued, practical again. Ryan will handle the details. The new owners are a young couple with a toddler. First home. Very excited. She smoothed the blanket over her knees. I've asked that they not be told about our disagreements. They deserve a fresh start. Of course, I agreed. The neighborhood will welcome them. Karen looked directly at me then. Will you make sure of that? People respect you, Harold. They always have, even when you didn't notice. The request surprised me, that she would entrust this to me, that she would acknowledge the community's regard. I will, I promised. And will you allow me to reimburse you for the water bills? Ryan has the calculations. It seems so petty now, but I'd like to leave with accounts settled. I shook my head. That's not necessary. It is to me, she insisted with a flash of her old determination. Pride is a luxury for those with time. I'm working on letting go of mine. I nodded, understanding this need for resolution. If it's important to you, then yes. We talked for nearly an hour as the sun descended, not about hoses or HOA rules, but about lives lived. Her career as a corporate efficiency consultant, her late husband who had died suddenly 5 years earlier, my 40 years of engineering, my marriage to Martha. We spoke of loss and adaptation, of the strange journey that had brought us to this porch as reluctant confidants. As I rose to leave, she stopped me with a question. Was it really sewage in the sprinkler that day? Despite everything, I found myself smiling. No. Gray water from a construction site. Dirty, smelly, but not dangerous. She almost laughed. Engineered for maximum impact but minimum harm. That fits you, Harold. We all have our areas of expertise, I conceded. Indeed we do. She extended her hand, thin but steady. Goodbye, Harold Thompson. In another life, we might have been friends. In this one, we made it to something like peace, I replied, taking her hand carefully. Safe journey, Karen. 3 weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. Ryan supervised as workers carefully packed his mother's belongings. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen, already in Chicago, I presumed, or perhaps too unwell to participate. I watched from my porch, remembering our conversation, feeling an unexpected melancholy at this conclusion. As the workers finished loading the last items, Ryan crossed the street toward me. She wanted you to have this, he said, handing me an envelope. Said you'd understand. Inside was a check covering exactly the amount of my water bill increases, calculated down to the penny, along with a simple note in elegant handwriting. Accounts settled. Thank you for the grace at the end. Also enclosed was a small golden key. I recognized it immediately, the replacement for my hose lock, the one she had cut off months earlier. A small gesture, symbolic rather than practical, but it spoke volumes about her desire to make things right, even in the smallest ways. How is she? I asked, carefully refolding the note. Fighting, Ryan answered. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? I nodded, thinking of my own mortality so recently highlighted by my heart attack. Tell her I'm tending my roses again. She'll know what that means. Ryan promised he would, and returned to oversee the final departure preparations. 2 days later, a young couple arrived at Karen's former house. The new owners, just as she had described. I watched from my garden as they explored their new property with the excitement of first-time homeowners, their toddler running circles around them on the lawn that had once been Karen's pride. That evening, I walked across the street with a housewarming gift, a basket Martha would have approved of, containing homemade bread, courtesy of Mrs. Rodriguez, local honey, and a bottle of decent wine. Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates, I said as they invited me in. I'm Harold Thompson from across the street. David and Mia Chen. The young husband introduced them both, while their daughter peeked shyly from behind her mother's legs. And this is Lily. We're still getting settled, as you can see. He gestured at the boxes stacked in the entryway. Moving is always chaotic, I acknowledged. If you need any help navigating the neighborhood or understanding the HOA rules, please don't hesitate to ask. They can be confusing at first. We've heard HOAs can be pretty strict, Mia said, a hint of concern in her voice. Ours is reasonable, I assured her. More focused on maintaining property values than controlling every detail. And we're working on making it even more family-friendly. I didn't elaborate on how recent that shift had been or the catalyst behind it. Some histories are better left undisturbed. As we chatted, I noticed their garden hose coiled neatly by their garage, new, green with its own spray nozzle attached. I see you're already set up for lawn care, I observed. David nodded. Previous owner left everything immaculate. We have big shoes to fill, garden-wise. You'll make it your own, I said. That's what matters most. 1 year later, on a perfect June evening, Oak Ridge Estates gathered for its annual summer barbecue, not at the community center as tradition had dictated, but spread across interconnected lawns, including mine. The event had transformed from a formal HOA function to a genuine neighborhood celebration, with children running between yards, adults sharing dishes and conversations, and a general sense of community that had been missing for too long. From my porch, I could observe it all. The Chen's daughter Lily playing with the Rodriguez grandchildren, Glenn manning a grill on his driveway, Mrs. Abernathy holding court from her wheelchair, surrounded by attentive listeners. The HOA still existed, of course, but under Margaret's revitalized leadership, it had scaled back its enforcement role to focus on community building. During a quiet moment, as twilight began to soften the edges of the day, David Chen approached me with 2 glasses of lemonade, offering one as he took the adjacent chair. Quite a difference from last summer, he observed. Mia and I were just saying how lucky we were to find this neighborhood. It's found its way back to what it always should have been, I replied. Ryan called last week, David said after a moment. He wanted us to know his mother passed away. Though expected, the news still landed with weight. Karen fought hard, I said quietly. David nodded. He mentioned you specifically, said his mother spoke of you often near the end, something about a lesson in boundaries she never forgot. I smiled slightly, remembering Karen on her porch, the blanket across her lap, her clear-eyed acknowledgement of our strange shared journey. We taught each other a few things. He also said she wanted you to know her grandchildren loved the roses you sent, that they brightened her last days. I hadn't expected Ryan to share that, my impulsive gesture of sending flower cuttings from my garden to Karen in hospice care. Not my prized roses, which were Martha's legacy, but the wild pink climbers that sprawled along my fence with cheerful disorder. As the party continued around us, David gestured toward his own yard, where Mia was showing Lily how to water newly planted flowers with their garden hose. Their hose, used properly, with respect for boundaries. Life goes on, he said simply. It does, I agreed, though not always as we expect. In my mind, I could still see Karen that first day, imperiously using my hose without permission, and myself, outraged at the violation. Such a small thing to ignite such conflict. Yet through that conflict had come unexpected transformation. For Karen, for our neighborhood, and perhaps most of all, for me. That evening, as the last guest departed and I prepared for bed, I found myself talking to Martha as I often did, sharing the day's events with her memory. "Karen's gone now, old girl," I said to her photograph. "Found her peace, I hope, as have I in my way." The neighborhood outside was quiet, homes settled for the night, boundaries clear but permeable, a community once again. Not perfect, no community ever is, but functioning with the give and take that makes shared living possible. All it had taken was a garden hose, a heart attack, a cancer diagnosis, and the humility to recognize that sometimes the most important boundaries are the ones we create not to separate us, but to show us how to live side by side with respect. In our autumn years, we often face unexpected battles that test our principles and patience. HOA Karen reminds us that behind every neighborhood conflict lies human vulnerability and the universal need for dignity. As we navigate our retirement communities, we must remember that respect for boundaries goes hand in hand with compassion for struggles we cannot see. The courage to stand firm when wronged is valuable, but so is the wisdom to recognize when victory matters less than grace. Our greatest strength comes not from winning arguments, but from maintaining our humanity when tested. Like Harold, we've earned the right to protect what's ours, but also to extend understanding when it matters most. The true measure of our character isn't how we handle victory, but how we embrace reconciliation. After all, good neighbors don't just respect property lines. They build bridges when life's challenges remind us all of our shared fragility. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channels so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.